You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
You may not be able to handle the truth, but these guys can. Welcome to the Long for Truth Show.
Heretic hunters.
Hey, what do you think of these guys?
I think they're damned and on their way to hell, and I don't think there's any redemption for them. You stink, frankly. That's the way I think about it.
Now, this particular episode in Samson's life appears to be the culmination of verse 4 in this chapter, which states that his father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. The it referring to Samson's marrying of a Gentile woman. Now, we look at Samson's life, and we see that Samson was a man of passion. He had a particular problem with women in particular, and we see this throughout his episode. Throughout the episode, different episodes of his life. He was just, for some reason, just was prone to give in to his fleshly desires for women. And this is particularly seen in the first half of this chapter, where he goes down to Timnah and he sees a woman. But all he does is see. He sees her, and it says the woman was right in his eyes. She's seen right, and so she goes back and asks her father, or he goes back and asks his father to get her. And of course, we know his parents object to the idea. And they say, hey, is there not a woman among our kinsmen and among all of Israel that you have to marry an uncircumcised person? And Adam pointed out very well last week that it was kind of a smack to Samson's face, because not only was this girl uncircumcised, she was one of the oppressors. She was one of the people of the Philistines that were oppressing Israel at the time, and would continue to do so even during the time of Samson. But it's important to keep in mind that God was sovereign over everything that was happening. Even in Samson's own sin in choosing this Gentile bride. But this is not to say that God had caused him to have ungodly desires. And it's not to say that God was the one that tempted him to sin. Oftentimes people would look at verse 4 and they would point to it and say, well, hey, this proves that God is the author of sin. Well, we know very well that God himself is not the author of sin. The book of James tells us very plainly that when a person is sinned, it's because they're dragged away by their own desires and their own lusts. However, that does not mean that God does not work within those choices to providentially guide and work out his own purpose and will. We see this as an example in Joseph's own life. And you remember when Joseph was hated by his brothers, how his brothers wanted to kill him. Yet his older brother Reuben said, no, let's not kill him lest we bring blood upon our own heads. Let's just sell him to the Ishmaelites. Later on, as Joseph is sold to the Ishmaelites, he goes down into Egypt, and he is taken as a slave in Potiphar's house. We see that God used this incident to prepare him to save Israel. In fact, when he finally reveals himself to his brothers when they come to him for food, his statement is, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, in order that many lives should be saved. So when we look in our text this morning, we can kind of read in between the lines of the author of Judges, I think, and see that even in the midst of Samson's bad choices, in the midst of his giving in to his flesh and his sinful desires, of how God providentially used this thing, particularly a wedding, in order to seek an occasion against the Philistines so that he could begin to deliver his people out of their hands. So we're going to look at the text this morning, and we're going to start and just kind of break it down. In verses 10 and 11, we see first the wedding preparations that Samson and his father are making. And I just want to read that very quick. Verse 10 said, his father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. Now, Samson's father has begun the process of obtaining the bride for his son. And as was customary in that time, and still are probably in many cultures, there was a dowry expected to be paid. In other words, a price had to be paid in order to take a wife. A wife just wasn't given to a person with no cost. In his book, Manners and Customs of Bible Lands, Fred Wright states why that dowry price was set. He says, in the Orient, when the bride's parents gave their daughter in marriage, they were actually diminishing the efficiency of their family. Often unmarried daughters would tend the flock of their father, or they would work in the field or render help in other ways. Thus, upon her marriage, a young woman should be thought of as increasing the efficiency of her husband's family and diminishing that of her parents. Therefore, a young man who expected to get possession of their daughter must be able to offer some sort of adequate compensation. This compensation was known as the dowry. So we can see from custom that the reason why dowry is offered was because taking away from that family at that time diminished the work. It diminished the productivity, so to speak, of the family. Now, when we look at the text closely, we can probably ascertain from verse 8, even though that's not part of our text, that this, what was happening now, was going to be the actual wedding and the consummation. The dowry had probably already been set. Whether it had been paid or not, I don't know, but it had already been set. And verse 8 tells us that after some days he returned to take her, talking about Samson. So apparently, customary usual time frame was about a year or so once the betrothal took place before a husband would return to take his wife. But Wright also makes comment about the manner in which the father and son would often travel together in order to negotiate the terms for the marriage. And so, again, we see that this was probably in the first half of the chapter where Samson encountered the lion on the way. And the second one here, the event presented here in our text, would be the actual wedding where the feast and the consummation of the marriage would take place. But then we encounter the next peculiarity of the custom of the day. It says Samson is given 30 companions as wedding friends. Now, when I first read this text, I kind of thought to myself, what was so significant about the number 30? Well, there isn't really. It was just a number kind of thrown at him. However, very, very interesting what the historian Josephus talks about this text. Josephus says this, now the people of Timnath, out of the dread of the young man's strength, gave him during the time of the wedding feast, for then he feasted them all, 30 of the most stout of their youth, in pretense to be his companions, but in reality to be a guard upon him, that he might not attempt to give them any disturbance. So what Josephus is basically saying, apparently somehow, this idea that Samson was a strong guy, that God had given him some kind of a supernatural strength, had reached the ears of the Philistines. Now, we're not recorded any event in Samson's life in particular why they would have known this. The only thing we have read thus far of Samson is him tearing a lion apart with his bare hands. Whether that incident had reached the ears of the Philistines or something else, we don't really know. But notice that Josephus gives us two reasons why they gave him 30 companions. Number one, it was to be a guard. Okay, so they were basically guarding Samson, kind of making sure that he wasn't going to cause any trouble, as per se. But the second thing I want to point out, what Josephus says about this, is that they were stout men. All of them were stout men. And basically what Josephus is implying here is that these men were no wimps. These were not just 30 guys that they just picked out of random to come and be Samson's companions. They were strong, physically able men. Probably they were some kind of a men in the fighting force of the Philistines, whether you would call that an army or whatever. But they were stout men. They were very strong. These were people who were probably had the reputation of being able to take care of their own, as it said, in a fight, to be able to throw down when something happened. So we see that Samson is giving these companions to kind of be with him during the feast. Now, it was customary for the bride to have her relatives as companions of the bridegroom. However, we must also realize from the text and from other ancient sources that there were some hidden motives within their giving the companions to Samson. Verses 12 through 14, we have Samson's riddle. Samson, as again another customary thing, was for the bridegroom to participate in the festivities, and part of those festivities was a riddle. But I want us to look at this riddle just briefly. Verse 14, it says, "He said to them, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." Now, obviously, Samson is referring to his incident with the lion. And earlier in the chapter, we see he encounters a lion. He tears the lion apart. A year or so later, he comes back down and he finds honey in the lion. But the arrangement that Samson makes with his guests is that if they cannot guess his riddle, they will give him 30 changes of clothes. And if they do guess the riddle, he himself will give them 30 changes of clothes. Now, this kind of seems strange to us, but in that day, wealth wasn't always measured by silver and gold. It was measured by the amount of cattle, sheep that a person had. It was measured by the amount of clothes and cloth that a family secured. I mean, it wasn't like they could just go down to the corner market and just buy an extra set of clothes. Most of the time, the clothes that they worked in were the clothes that they slept in, and that was the clothes they wore day to day to day until they wore out. And so Samson's price here, almost to me, seems like he's very arrogant in his attitude. He's giving them a riddle that only he knows that will be able to solve. He's giving them a riddle from his own personal experience, thinking that they will not be able to solve it, so he will somehow obtain some kind of a wealth from this. So we don't really know exactly what he intended to do with the prize that he won in this contest, whether he intended to give some of it to his own family or whether he intended to keep it all. We're just not really told. However, I think it does show a little bit about the arrogance that Samson had. Then when we come down to verse 15, we see something different here. Verse 15, we see the Philistines not being able to figure out this riddle. They've gone 3 days now. Okay, they've gone 3 days. They've got 4 days left here before they can figure out the riddle. And on the seventh day, if they can't figure out that riddle, they got to pay up. Now, these stout men, who were probably just as arrogant as Samson, if not more, began to go to Samson's wife to hound him. Verses 15 says this. It says, on the fourth day they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? Now I want to take a side note here just to address a textual critical note that's present. The KJV translates verse 15, on the seventh day it came to pass, while the more modern versions say the fourth day. Now, the translation committee of the New English Translation, which is a work that's known for its textual criticism and for manuscript evidence, states this about this verse. It says the Masoretic text, which the Masoretic text is the traditional Hebrew text that most of the Hebrew Bibles are based on. The Masoretic text reads seventh. In Hebrew, there's a difference of only one letter between the words, and I can't really pronounce these, Riashif, and which is fourth, and something, which is seventh. I'm sorry, I can't see the words really, and I can't pronounce it. And it says, some ancient textual witnesses, like the Septuagint and the Syriac Peshitta, read fourth here, which certainly harmonizes better with the preceding verse for 3 days, and with verse 17. Another option is to change the word three at the end of 14 to the Hebrew word which means fourth, but the resulting scenario does not account as well for verse 17, which implies that the bride, Samson's bride that is, had been hounding Samson for more than 1 day. Also, Charles Hervey, who was one of the contributors of the Pulpit Commentary, in his exposition on the book of Judges, he comments on this passage. He says, there is some apparent difficulty in understanding how to reconcile this statement, and he's talking about the seventh day, with what it was said in verse 14, that they could not in 3 days expound the riddle, and also with what is said in verse 16 and 17, that Samson's wife wept before him the 7 days of the feast. And several different readings have arisen from this difficulty. In this verse, the reading of the fourth day for the seventh, and the omission of the words, and it came to pass on the seventh day, and then the latter part of verse 14, 7 days for 3 days. But all difficulty will disappear if we bear in mind the peculiarity of the Hebrew narrative noticed in note to section verses 1 through 6 of chapter 2 when we come to consider verse 16. He goes on to talk about her enticing the husband. He says, entice the husband, like in Judges 16:5, that he may declare unto us. If the text is sound, they must mean to say, declare it unto you, that you may declare it unto us. In other words, declare it unto us through you. But it is simpler either to read with a Septuagint, which has the fourth day, that he may declare unto you, or to read and declare unto us in the imperative mood. Okay, so that sounded a little bit confusing. So what is all that saying? Basically, what the New English Translation Committee said was that the ancient witnesses, in other words, the manuscripts that were older and closer dated back to the original, reads the fourth day. Hervey, who in his exposition states that the text itself can be easily resolved by comparing it with other scriptures. So, either way, I don't think it makes much of a difference whether you have one reading that says the seventh day or the one reading that says the fourth day. The important thing I think the author of Judges is pointing out is, number one, that the men of the Philistines enticed Samson's wife. They threatened her. And number two, that if they didn't, that if they didn't get the answer, they were going to kill her. Okay, so that's the main focus upon this particular passage. It's not whether this occurred on the fourth day or whether this occurred on the seventh day. Because either way, what follows, we're going to see, is kind of Samson's outrage in his seeking against the Philistines. Which we come to Samson's wife in verses 16 and 17, her pleading with Samson to reveal his riddle. So now these men have come to him, these stout men. Remember, they're physically strong. They're not some wimp guys that they just randomly picked to be with Samson. These are probably men known for their toughness. They've come to Samson's wife. They've threatened her. They've said, look, either you get your husband to tell us a riddle, or we're going to burn not just you, we're going to burn your father. So she goes to Samson and she pleads with him. She's in a desperate to save her own life and that of her father. Now I want us to know something here, that her language is very, very strong. She tells Samson, what does she say? She says, you hate me. You don't love me. It's very, even in the Hebrew, that is very, very strong language. In the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Old Testament, the author, Jeff Benner, kind of gives insight into the word that his wife uses as the word love. Listen, I want you to listen carefully, because it's very, very interesting when she tells Samson, you don't love me. It says, the pictograph here represents one who was looking at a great sight with his hands raised, as when saying, behold. The bait is just the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The bait is a representation of a tent or a house. Combined, these pictures mean to look toward the house or to provide for the family. One does not choose a household which one is born into, including tribe, parents, children, and wife, as marriages were often arranged by the father. It is a gift from God. These gifts are seen as a privilege and are to be cherished and protected. So, the Hebrew word, in the context of this passage and other ancient sources such as Josephus, seem to suggest that Samson's wife, though pleading for an answer to the riddle, was actually pleading for her life. She was pleading with her husband to protect her and her family, which was the obligation of the husband. Now what follows is Samson's answer. Samson comes to his wife in the latter half of verse, I think I lost my place here, I'm sorry. Oh, in the latter half of verse 16, I'm sorry. He said, Samson's wife tells him, you hate me, you give me a riddle, you haven't even told me yet. Listen to Samson's response. Behold, I have not told my father nor my mother. Shall I tell you? Does that seem kind of cold? Here is Samson's brand new bride, one that he is under obligation by God to protect. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, we have the very first mandate of what a marriage should be. God says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his own wife, and they shall become one flesh. Samson seemed to have more love for his parents than he did for the woman that was, in all intents and purposes, in his mind at least, was going to be his lifelong companion. His wife. Now some may consider this commendable in our culture. Of course, we live in an upside-down culture. But God has made it clear that the wife is to be one with the husband. And in Genesis 2:24, the word for cleave is a very strong word in and of itself. In fact, it's used throughout the Pentateuch for Israel to cleave or to hold fast unto God and to keep His statutes and commandments. And all throughout the Pentateuch, when it talks about Israel holding fast to God, that's the very word that it uses. This kind of gives us a picture of what the marriage should be between the husband and the wife. Basically, if you want to put it in modern terms, you're in it together. You're in it for life. Hang on to each other for dear life. Don't let go. Yet it seems that Samson, in his pride to want to win this contest strictly based on fleshly reasons so he could have a few extra changes of clothes, forsook the very first commandment of marriage that God had given him. And so, in verses 18, or excuse me, in verses 17 through 19, we see that the men finally, or that Samson's wife finally entices him to tell her. And that she goes and tells the men, and Samson's riddle is solved. Verse 17, it says, she wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted. And on the 7th day, he told her, because she pressed him hard. Then she told the riddle to her people. The KJV says she lay sore upon him. Now, without giving too much away, I just want to make a brief note. I want you to keep this in your minds for later on. Because this same word, lay sore upon, or she pressed hard, this very exact same Hebrew word will come up again in Samson's life. The author kind of seems to be setting up this pattern of Samson that Samson has with his flesh, and particularly with women. But it's interesting that this particular verse, the tidbit in this verse, the information is provided by external sources. And I want to return again to Josephus. And I want to read this kind of section, how he perceives this section here. Now remember, Josephus was a first century Jewish historian who wrote about the Jews' history, basically, the entire Jewish history. It says, and they were not able, he's talking about the Philistines, in 3 days' time to find out the meaning of the riddle. They desired the damsel to discover it by means of her husband and to tell it to them. And they threatened to burn her if she did not tell it to them. So when the damsel entreated Samson to tell it her, he at first refused to do it. But when she lay hard on him and fell into tears and made his refusal to tell it a sign of his unkindness to her, he informed her of his slaughter of a lion and how he found bees in his breast, and carried away 3 honeycombs and brought them to her. So in other words, what Josephus is saying is that Samson relayed the entire story to her of how when he was going down, he ran into a lion, he tore the lion open. Then when he come back down again to get her, he found the honey in the lion. This absolutely makes, excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied here. This actually makes sense with the text. Because if Samson's opponents would have just come to him and said, oh, we figured out your riddle, it's a lion. Samson would have been, okay, tell me more. So in order to completely win the contest, they had to give a reason for that riddle. And this is exactly what the men do. They gather to him on the 7th day. And notice the author just kind of slips this in. And I think he shows us their cunning. It says, just before the sun went down. Because when the sun went down, that was the end of the feast. And they would have lost the riddle. So they make it appear as if for the 7 days they've just been thinking really, really hard about this riddle. And right before the sun goes down, they're like, go get Samson. We've got the answer to his riddle. So they bring Samson in. And they say, hey, we figured out your riddle there, man. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And then Samson's response. Again, Samson was not very good with his words. He says, if you would not have plowed with my heifer, you would have not figured out my riddle. Wow, that's a great way to start out a marriage, to call your wife a heifer. Now, Samson's euphemism there was a bit dry, but basically, heifers, oxen were used to plow a field. But it was very culturally taboo to use somebody else's oxen to plow your own field. So basically what Samson is saying is, you used my heifer to plow your field. In other words, so that you could gain advantage over me. So, Samson's words tell us a couple of things about that. His response, that is, to the riddle, tells us, or at least it tells me a couple of things, and just a couple of observations I made. First of all, I want us to note that Samson was probably not completely oblivious to what was going on around him. In other words, he knew something was up. He may have not known all the details, but he did know something was going on. The text makes it abundantly clear of his wife's crying and pleading. This in and of itself should have kind of set off alarms in Samson's head that this was more than just her wanting to know a riddle. Because his wife moved from actual pleading to begging and tears. The simple fact that Samson probably knew something was amiss seems to indicate his lack of concern. Perhaps he didn't care because he thought that, hey, I'm strong, so if something happens to me, I can take care of myself anyway. But again, going back to the first mandate to cleave unto his wife, he had an obligation to take care of his wife and to protect her and her family. The second thing I want us to point out about Samson's reply to the riddle is that he used this event as an excuse to vent his own anger. Another thing we see about Samson throughout Samson's life is that he was a very angry man. He was given prone to fits of rage. Verse 19 says, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon, and struck down 30 men in the town, and took their spoil, and gave the garments to those who he had told the riddle. Make no mistake, when Samson goes down to Ashkelon, he doesn't just beat these guys up. The text is very, very clear that he kills them. He commits murder in order to get the clothes and the things that he needs to pay off his bet. He slew, it says, 30 Philistines. So Samson has not only given into his flesh by marrying an uncircumcised woman, now he has completely defiled himself because of his Nazirite vow. He was told that he was not allowed to approach a dead body, not even to go near his mother or father if they had died. Samson has completely forsaken his Nazirite vow, and he's completely forsaken the statutes and the commandments of God not to kill, not to murder. He made the bet. He's the one that set forth the price. And when he lost, he went in childlike anger, throwing a temper tantrum. And it cost the lives of 30 other people. And I certainly by no means say that these 30 men were innocent in any way. I mean, we don't know. They were Gentile. They were uncircumcised. However, Samson, as a Jewish Nazirite who was supposed to have been set apart for God, did know, which makes his act all the more detestable. And it makes him all the more accountable before God on that account. Then in verse 20, we have the author setting up, actually it's the end of verse 19. In verse 20, it seems like the author is kind of setting up the further adventures in Samson's life that we're going to read about. It says, in hot anger, this is the end of verse 19, in hot anger, he went back to his father's house. And then, verse 20, Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his attendant or his friend. Basically, you could say it was kind of his best man in a sense. So what the author of Judges is doing is he's setting up the very next chapter. In the very next chapter, we're going to see that Samson actually returns to take his wife. But guess what? She's consummated the marriage with another man. And this will be further, in Samson's mind at least, further means to take revenge on the Philistines. So what is it we can learn from this episode of Samson's wedding, from his riddle, from the things that ensued as a result of this? First, I want us to realize that as a husband, Samson had the obligation to protect his wife. The Bible tells us that a wife, in Proverbs 18:22, that whoever finds a wife has found a good thing from the Lord. A favor is actually how it's translated. What we are given as good from the Lord is not something that should be taken lightly. Samson failed miserably at this during his first married fight. After he lost the riddle, he stormed out in anger and threw a temper tantrum. Scripture is clear that our wives are our companions in the mandate of the Great Commission to make disciples. In fact, Peter emphasizes on this in 1 Peter 3:7 when he says, "Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as a weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you in the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." So we're told that when we do not honor and protect our wives, that our prayers are hindered. Now, from Vine's Expository Dictionary, gives a little bit of insight into this word in 1 Peter 3:7, where he talks about being hindered. And basically the word was that when people would go out and they would break up a road, there would be rocks and trees and wood and all kinds of things in the road that would be a hindrance to other people traveling. An unnecessary hindrance. So Peter is telling us that this is the kind of hindrance that is in our way when we fail to honor and cherish and protect and love our wives. But the second thing that I want to point out is something that we talked at the very beginning about in this sermon. It says, though Samson made foolish choices and disregarded his Nazirite vow, we cannot forget that it was God using his sinful actions to his own glory. And again, I point out that it wasn't God that caused him to sin. No, it was Samson's own choice. God just providentially used that in order to start the deliverance of his people from the Philistines. We'll see God's providence and sovereignty again throughout Samson's life, and especially at the end. The main point is that even amidst the foolish decision from God's people, me, you, when we make foolish decisions, God is able to take that and redeem it for his own purposes. This is something that can comfort us. But at the same time, we have to look at the things that Samson did and the foolish decisions that he made. And we have to learn to avoid those same pitfalls. However, we need to also realize that in the midst of our sinful choices, though we make those sinful choices, we repent and forsake that sin, God, in his sovereignty, in his wisdom, in his grace, is able to take those decisions that we have made and to completely turn it on its head in order to bring something out of it that would work in accordance with his purpose. So as we consider this morning Samson's life, or at least a small portion of it, let us keep those two things in mind. That God has given us a family to cherish and protect, and that God is able to make, even of our own sin, something that would bring him honor and glory.